You're good to go, Mike.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Barnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's QUASI seminar. These seminars are designed to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying topics relevant to corporate social innovation. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, teachers, and practitioners, we know that too many studies focus on questions that only rehash and rename established ideas, and it may have no practical impact. It's our hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our theoretical and practical understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, does corporate social and environmental reporting really matter? Answering in the affirmative, we have Jody Gruwell. Arguing against, we have Charles Joe. Clarifying the contingencies is Paulo Quadra. I get a little reverberation in that. That's pretty good. And then providing a practical perspective, we have Kent Pucker. All right. So as each of these presenters argue their positions, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. The open discussion will occur after all of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that remains thereafter. So let's get it started. Over to you, Jody, please.
Great. Hi, thanks for the introduction. That woke me up.
Sure.
I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So yeah, I'm Jody Gruwell, Assistant Professor of Accounting at U of T, the Rutman School of Management. I'm really excited to be here and have this opportunity. I wasn't sure how contentious to be, but then I saw Charles Cho is also Canadian and on this, so I decided I'd be a little more tame and polite, but let's see how this goes. Okay, so I think there are a few ways of looking at this question, right? I think it was purposely open to interpretation, and because I'm a financial economist, I've decided to look at it in terms of whether corporate sustainability matters for a firm's access to capital. The reason I'm focusing on access to capital is because it's really important, right? The ability to obtain affordable capital quickly and when you need it can be the difference really between longevity and growth, or kind of just as an organization. And when you have that ability to obtain affordable capital, you can fund your plans, expand, and have investment in maybe some discretionary areas like research and development. I think it's for this reason, largely, that researchers in kind of my area, financial economics, as well as researchers in the investment industry, so investment professionals, have been somewhat obsessed over the past 3 decades, I'd say almost, with looking at the relation between sustainability, corporate sustainability, and the firm's ability to access capital. All right, so just to make sure we're on the same page, because I don't know the background of everyone here today. Just briefly, like, how do firms actually get this capital, right? Get it? Well, you can issue debt by borrowing money. You can also sell off stock, right? Ownership by equity issuances. So that's for publicly listed companies. They can do this on the public debt and equity markets. But the catch is, investors, whether you're debt holders or your equity holders, you require a rate of return on that investment. That can take the form of dividends, interest payments, capital gains, market value appreciation. So, if we just for simplicity purposes, look at that collectively as that required rate of return, that's, what we call the cost of capital, encompassing both the cost.
Jody, just a quick point, because your sound does cut in and out a bit. I think I've got
okay.
Muted who's wasn't. If you could just, maybe
closer. Sure. All right. Keep me posted on how it goes, because I don't want Charles to get the upper hand because people can hear me. All right. So, so that encompassing the cost of equity and the cost of debt, and when I'm talking about cost of capital, right? So theoretically, I think it's just, we should just talk about there for a second, like the link between sustainability and the cost of capital. What could that be? I mean, if investors view sustainability to be value decreasing, right? If they don't see the value in sustainability, then they would view companies that are putting money into sustainability negatively. right? They might see that as a risk and, sign of poor corporate governance in a poorly managed firm. That would increase the riskiness of the firm, and they would require that rate of return to be higher. And that would result in a higher cost of capital for the firm. On the other hand, if you view sustainability more as potentially value enhancing, signal of corporate, competence, adaptability, say to a low carbon economy, looking, at risk management and taking that seriously, as well as opportunities for the future, that kind of thing, then they might view that as they would lower that threshold for their rate of return on the investment. So it all comes down to that NPV assessment, that net present value assessment on the investment that they're making. And I think with, like for reporting more specifically, in recent years, but this is really going back a while now, the value of financial reports alone has really been called into question, right? Like these regulated reports, they serve a very important purpose, but they are bound by strict rules and conservatism in accounting regarding what we can measure and how we report it. And it serves to really protect the downside risk of investors. But the big criticism of that is, it limits the ability of investors and those seeking to understand the upside potential or the future prospects of the firm. And we're missing kind of other information that's not so bound by these rules. Okay, so it's not that, I'm not saying it's, that financial reporting needs to necessarily be revamped completely, but there is some potential value in complementing financial information with maybe sustainability information or other non-financial information that can help complete the picture, right? Understand the value creation process within the firm, provide more insights into risk management and capitalization of opportunities. So, and if that happens, right, if that is the case, then investors may view the provision of sustainability information as helping to lower information asymmetry that can exist between insiders of the firm, right, that know a lot more, and investors that are sitting on the outside and want to know more. All right, so what do we see? I've got a big list of references at the end, my favorite papers, like the biggest hits for me at least. But in summary, right, we see that when companies issue a sustainability report for the first time, these firms experience a reduction in their cost of capital. The main channel there seems to be through something that I'll talk about a little more in a moment, the role of information intermediaries that can interpret that information and provide less noisy estimates of the future financial performance of the firm. Okay, so that's that reduced information asymmetry channel. We also see that CSR ratings tend to help firms gain more access to capital or lower their capital constraints. There are these composite measures of capital constraints that have been used. And there the channel again is lower information asymmetry through transparency, as well as enhanced stakeholder engagement. And then if you have concerns about CSR ratings, which I definitely do, and talk about that again later, is if you want potentially a more concrete outcome of sustainability, like carbon emissions, a paper that I highly recommend has looked at what the disclosure decisions are about emissions and how that relates to firm value. They do a lot to try and correct for that self-selection bias and all that. But the punchline is that all firms are penalized for disclosing emissions, right? So for every 1,000 metric tons of CO2 that are voluntarily disclosed, the firm value decreases by about $212,000. But a further penalty is imposed on firms that don't disclose that information. Okay, so market participants are not fooled by withholding that information. Okay, they see that as even riskier. Okay, so maybe I've somewhat convinced you that there is this relation here, but it's probably more important to see why that can happen, like how that information gets translated into investment decisions and capital allocation. Information intermediaries that I mentioned a moment ago Financial analysts, credit analysts are increasingly using sustainability information and incorporating this into their analyses, right? And you know, given the importance of these information intermediaries for both retail but also large institutional investors, this can actually have a pretty big impact, right? If this gets reflected in their recommendations, their buy, hold, sell recommendations, their projections of future earnings per share, cash flows, income, and they're relied upon by investors, this is where how we can see those big effects. So a couple of papers here that I'll mention. One uses a large sample of US firms over 15 years and observes a real shift. They call this a shift in logic, institutional logic, where in the earlier kind of period of their sample, the 1990s, analysts were issuing more pessimistic recommendations for companies that had strong CSR performance or CSR ratings. And they viewed this as, you know, at that time, CSR was largely viewed as an agency cost, right? Rent extraction, and really not seeing the compelling case from a firm value enhancing perspective. And then later on, that logic seemed to shift away from being pessimistic towards less pessimistic and eventually actually optimistic, right? And I'm not talking about methods, I just don't have the time, but you know, relative to otherwise, you know, matched firms, similar dimensions, by having poor CSR performance. And I think an area that, you know, could be, there's a lot of opportunity there. It's just the data is hard to work with. It's not available as much as equity, but the debt side, right? So looking at credit risk ratings, but I mean, one paper has found a very high correlation between ESG scores and the risk of credit default, credit risk, sorry, and default. So getting a little bit on there. And then, not academic paper, but, you know, large scale survey of chartered financial analysts, I mean, you know, over a quarter or under a quarter, I guess, to say that they don't consider ESG, but the other side, well, close to 3/4 say that they consider at least one of those dimensions, environmental, social, or governance, in their investment decisions. Okay, and finally, this piece is not as much accounting related, but I still think it's really important for us to try and look into that, I guess, black box. Like, still, what is it about sustainability that can help, you know, with the capital allocation and the incorporation of that information into firm value? Well, I feel pretty convinced through a number of studies, and this one in particular, that CSR matters for reputation and trust. Okay, so when one study looked at the impact of the financial crisis on, you know, trust more generally, and, you know, both for financial institutions, but just capital markets at large, they found that firms that before the crisis had invested in CSR, call their construct as social trust or social capital, you know, those firms ended up doing better than an otherwise similar group of firms that had not made those investments, that had not built up that social capital in terms of stock returns, profitability, growth, ability to raise debt. And they attribute that to really building up that trust and how it can preserve firm value and actually pay off when there are these periods of distrust. And then the employee side, I feel like that's another area where the research has gotten really, really strong in showing that employees care about sustainability. So randomized field experiments in an online marketplace, labor marketplace, found that when a worker learns about their employer's social responsibility, they're willing to accept a lower wage. Their wage requirement falls, and that's concentrated really interestingly in the highest performing workers. Okay, and you'd think those are the ones that demand the highest wages. So, you know, you're getting the you know, the real revealed preference for CSR among your top employees. And then, you know, on the other side, do companies think that the sustainability is, you know, relating to their employees and the investments they make, workplace benefits and health and safety? You know, is that really kind of fostering the motivation, engagement, mitigation of adverse behaviors like shirking and absenteeism? It seems to be the case there too. Right. We were also asked to comment on, either like what we hate seeing when we open up a review paper, a paper to review, or some ideas for the future. I mean, it's been, I think, a concern for a lot of us, what these ratings reflect. There are a lot of ESG data providers, and those ratings are not necessarily correlated, right? They've got a lot of different methods that are hard for us as researchers to observe. They can deviate substantially. So I've got the working paper on there on the bottom of the screen, but what they did is they used a complicated but convincing noise correction approach to try and address the bias that may be introduced by the noise in ESG ratings. And they found that when they corrected that, when they tried to correct that bias, that the effects of ESG on stock returns was even stronger than the literature has suggested. Okay. And I'm really interested in this from the disclosure perspective, right? How can we tease out that noise when companies are also sharing that information with us, right? Can we actually detect and find ways to correct or greenwashing, right? Just either that's just selective disclosure of good information while withholding bad, or it's trying to paint a rosy picture when one does not exist. So that was one idea I had. Long list of references. Thanks a lot. Look forward to everyone else's thoughts.
All right. Thank you very much, Jody. Now it's time for some turmoil in Toronto, some chaos in Canada. We'll turn it over to Charles Cho. Yeah, Jody, if you could stop sharing yours, and then yeah, thank you. Charles, you still out there? You gonna offer us the counter Canadian perspective?
Jody, he gave up.
Uh-oh, he quits. I think he's just slowly sneaking up on us here. Let's see.
Can you all see the screen now?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, we are not only in the same country, but we are in the same city, and I actually happen to live much closer to the University of Toronto than York University. So thanks, Mike, for inviting us to spice up this debate. And on that note, I couldn't help but notice that, yeah, Jerry Davis had tweeted that, you got the spiciest accountants of all, and then apparently the bar is quite low to be spicy, according to Mike. So hopefully we'll live up to our reputation of being spicy in that field. So thank you again. So I'm going to start with just a very brief background on epistemological view of accounting research, because I think the audience obviously is not majority accountants. So and I feel very like an imposter to talk about this, but at the same time, this is some of the first reading I had in my doctoral program, first year, first class, the Burn Morgan paradigm, sociological paradigm, and organizational analysis. Just basically the two matrix of how to view the world. And I think that has shaped a lot of things that, at least personally, how I was trained and how I look at accounting research. So I'm not gonna do any lecture on that, no worries. I'll get to the question very soon. But what I did, actually, this is a slide I retrieved from my comms, imagine that, that's a long time ago, that applying what accounting research could be from the perspective and the paradigm versus a functionalist versus a radical humanist, radical structuralist, interpretative. I mean, you can, kind of look at what kind of research topic and methods can be fitting in those boxes. But basically, there is a functionalist view out there on the bottom right corner. Like I put a circle there, and then a more view of a more eclectic and kind of being the armadillo in the middle of the road, to be embracing different perspectives on accounting. So having that, I introduce why I'm talking about this, because looking at the question that does corporate social and environmental reporting really matter, if a researcher or anybody views the world, for example, from the Burr-Morgan perspective, the functional perspective, basically Y is explained by or associated with X. And in terms of methods, it goes along with quantitative sample method, which also I use, but more like the theory used. And the focus of accounting research is really focused on markets as a dominant institution of society. And relatedly, from an investor perspective, then as Jody brilliantly demonstrated, it obviously matters, right? It does matter because it does, and I will provide more insight on that at the end for all the reasons she listed, and I know exactly what that other side is, because if you take a stand and information and this reporting is going to affect your capital, your access to capital, your return on investments, of course it does. But I inherited the no position, kind of strongly suggested by Mike, is like, aren't you a no? And you could be a depends. So I took the no. Some colleagues were like, are you sure like you're going to be okay doing this? And okay. But I think Paolo got the easiest one, but it depends, because I mean, the real answer is it does depend. I will still do my best to defend the no position, because I'm going to start with this question that these social environmental reporting issues, or no, social environmental reporting should or should not address social environmental issues beyond maybe market concerns or investor worries about whether the market is favorable to them. So I'm starting with sort of what's happening in, for example, a really good example of what's happening in today's development. When Mike asked me, what's going on in the accounting world? This is what's going on. You have the IFRS Foundation, which has now set up a call for consultation 18 months ago, and in last November, created what they wanted to create, the International Stress and Risk Standard Board. So that standard board, when they created it, was based on the premises of, again, a very strong focus on investor. They're explicit about it. The only thing that if you see the square boxes there, they seem to conflate what public interest really means, because for them it's kind of value creation to investors. And as long as you do that, you are actually recognizing the importance of public interest. So I found it a little bit interesting that they put that in the same sentence. But everywhere that you will read their justification and their explanation of what they're going to be doing, it is to focus on enterprise value. It is about meeting the needs of the information needs of the investors. Once again, it is investor focused. It is justified by the demand by financial markets to build upon market-led initiatives in order to, supposedly solve or address sustainability, planetary sustainability issues. So in that aspect, I'm bringing up two kind of different perspective on, what are the motivations of this such reporting. Some of them I think you have seen before in the previous intervention, that yes, CSR or social environmental disclosure, reducing information asymmetry, useful information, accurate, reliable data. The focus is very much on that, explaining firm financial performance and investor-based capture of that value, right? The problem is that if you do take such a one-sided narrow perspective, it could actually, negatively impact the ultimate development of better disclosure to address the impacts and social, environmental, and economics impact of the business. So that's one thing, that one set of research in this sphere that has been quite documented, well published in mostly capital market mainstream journals relatively recently. And you have sort of the other perspective, which is based on sociopolitical theories. And I don't have a lot of quotes, I only have one. I think it says it all, by Rob Gray in 2006, where the vast majority of corporate reporting is voluntary, partial, and mostly trivial, because you cannot really make a reliable estimate of an actual performance of an organization with such data. Such reporting, from this perspective at least, is viewed as a very positive portraying of the image. There is really no strict penalties or even regulations that are enforced to say things, aka greenwash. And that's viewed as more a legitimacy and impression management tool. So those are two camps that have been going on for years. There's always a debate whether it's solved or not. I mean, that's really up to the reader and the researcher or whoever to decide, but that's where we are. So some of the, there's a lot of my findings, so I'm gonna just present what I've been doing over the last 15 years or so. Poor environmental performers, like the ones who are not doing so well, tend to have a higher level of disclosure and have more optimistic and less certain in the language in terms of the environmental disclosure. So that's under the theory of what we saw earlier, the legitimacy theory. Firms that don't do well tend to try to justify and explain why, and sometimes deflect attention and talk about something else, or sometimes even deny their bad performance. Some of the things also that even more so, a discourse about how much they care about the environment, but they put a lot of money in terms of political scene to push for environmental damaging, such as drilling legislation, like we show in one of the papers cited above. And the latest, more like theoretical piece that we had put was about hypocrisy, admittedly sometimes under very constraining situations with stakeholder conflicts. They're forced to engage hypocrisy, develop facade, and that could limit really the evolution of substantive disclosure, meaningful disclosure in these social environmental issues. So some examples that you can see, some of them I got it from my own data, but you can see oil and gas company are having this very similar disclosure on, yes, we operate responsibly, yes, we are more stewards, yes, we minimize the impact, yes, we are sensitive to habitats and conservation, and just another one that is not so environmental focus on community needs, and we are making a lot of donations, right? So whether that is true or not, it remains seen, but sometimes those are very shallow words that you can very much copy paste the same thing over, and I don't know really what that means. On that aspect, I don't believe that it really matters what you say, because the actions don't follow, because we know it's always a matter of what you say and what you do. And big oil and gas firms like Exxon and Chevron and more, BP, Shell, have excellent communication skills. They have professional communicators that write this report. So such disclosure, I'm not sure they really matter, just putting nice words out there, claiming all this, right? So what are examples? Some of the thing I had found earlier on is like different type of reporting has like graph disclosure. In here, we saw basically that there is a huge selection bias on what they want to report, but here a striking one is a very discrepancy out of scale graph, where they pretend that graph-wise they could look like it's 50% decrease of emission, but in fact, when you look at the numbers, it's actually only 7. So that's a bit distorted. So again, does this kind of reporting really matter? Because obviously there's something wrong here. In terms of reputation, here we looked at whether disclosure and performance will have an effect on reputation. And we found a little monster in the middle here, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, that when actually you report very well and you say nice words, you have a strong positive correlation to enter the DJSI. But actually, when you actually do pretty poorly, you can also enter the DJSI. So in that aspect, when you're in DJSI, you also gain a huge positive reputation because of the name Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So I guess in here, you can almost argue, oh, yeah, it matters. It does matter to enter, to become a member of the DJSI, because we have reporting that is appealing to the DJSI. But on the other hand, you're not really helping the environment and social issues, as I was mentioning earlier. Another one is, this is a bit of older study, but I think it's really telling our accountants. So we're going to use accounts like capital expenditures. Then Patton found that companies are making capital expenditure projection 1 year, even do 2 years. He did robustness check. Basically, they say they're going to spend this much on environmental projects, but at the end, when they go back to the further year, subsequent year, they have spent almost like not none, but like very, very, very much lower than they had said. So they can put all the dollars amount they want, and obviously there's no apparent control of that. Other ones, you know that Exxon Valdez, when there's a disaster, there's a huge spike on disclosure. What does it really mean? Does it really matter? Is it, again, a legitimacy tool? That wasn't a very old study, but hugely cited. Recently, on my dissertation, actually, I've done similar things in a French case, in a French setting, about this double crisis and how Total reacted to that with a lot of disclosures. So if really, I mean, sort of a conclusion here, if we only care about investors, like I said at the beginning, then it matters because ESG, which I found that this is not the same thing as sustainability from the planet's perspective, is important to them. You know, they need to make their return, so they need to have information that mitigate their risk. And you find keywords such as impact, materiality, opportunity, risk, investor integration. This is what it's about. This is a non-financial information that is useful for the investor to make more money, right? That's really what it is. So in that sense, I'm not sure we are addressing the social and environmental issues out there. But maybe the society should not be only about markets. Maybe we should focus on our planet per se. So, you know, the hope, the goal of such reporting was to increase such accountability. Well, I say is, but it was because we know that it hasn't reached that. We are not there yet. And, you know, we have things like greenwashing happening all the time. This is happening. This has happened for decades. But this word, which existed before, came a very trendy word, but it's basically what companies are saying versus what they're doing. And there's a huge disconnect, right? So accountability, what about the environment? What about the planet? What about biodiversity? All of these clearly contrasting with what the investor perspective of ESG is. And yeah, it doesn't really matter if you look at a broader societal perspective, because we saw that if it really mattered and it did something for society and the planet, then I don't think we'd be here. You know, those reporting standards and now standard boards that come, if they don't make it a serious disclosure for truthful and reliable, which right now is not the case, then to me that doesn't matter, right? So I just being very, I procrastinated on this, I have to say, but this is corporation greenwash for me is like, okay, there's still a lot of study that get submitted to some of my journals, some of I see in conferences, like we know they do, right? So trying to examine from a different setting, different sample, different country, different whatever industry, where the corporations do greenwash, to me it's not. The effectiveness of that and such reporting, and also from a user perspective, you know, I had put a call for paper to put said eye tracking, like what people are looking at these reports. Those are the questions I think a little bit more worth investigating today, more granular, you know, in terms of the effect on such reporting on society. So with that, I will leave the floor for the Professor Paolo Catrone, who will probably speak about the depends. But here's my contact information, and thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Now that we've toured Canada, let's stick around with the British Empire. Let's go on out to England and listen to Paolo tell us about the contingencies here.
Okay, let me put Zoom in a way that I can actually see you or your reactions. Okay, so it's actually not the British Empire, but I'll talk about some development in continental Europe, I would say, and a bit of history maybe of that. So thanks for the opportunity. Not easy at all to stay in the middle, Charles, but surely it is the wisest position. So as the Roman said, wisdom is always in the middle. And so does corporate social environmental reporting really matter? Of course it depends, but we need to understand on what it depends. And also, as was said in the chat, it depends for whom and for what. So I want to do a bit of, similar to what Charles and Jolly did, a bit of, let's say, accounting for dummies. Start from the beginning, I would say. And so for me, I think it depends on three things. It depends on perspective. So exactly what kind of focus do you have? Do you have a focus on the shareholders? Do you focus on society? Do you focus on nature? So I think that the perspective matters. I think it's a matter of practices. So what kind of practices do you use? What kind of income statements do you use? What kind of double entry bookkeeping do you use? What kind of, you know, how do you draw the lines on a piece of paper to report and to give an account, to tell the story? I think that these things do matter. And of course, related to these practices, there are also the institutional arrangements. And so these are the three things that I will explore, and hopefully quite quickly. And I would like to start from a very basic accounting 101 lecture. This is possibly the only accounting statement that nowadays is taught in universities. When I was a kid, let's say 35 years ago, at the university, I studied 6 or 7 different ways in which you can report and you can draw an income statement. This is just one amongst many. And it does have a specific focus, which is that the firm is looked at with a specific focus, and that is the focus of the shareholders, because the origin of this statement this statement emerged during the Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution in particular. Firms were mainly dedicated to manufacturing, and so you have manufacturing here, the contribution of manufacturing, then the other functions, then the finance function, which is important, then you have the separation of management versus ownership, and the shareholder wanted to know how the different functional managers were doing. And of course, the profit was the objective of corporation at that time, and the auditors were paid by the owners because they were serving the interest of the owner of the firm. And that explains why we are in that strange huge conflict of interest at the moment, where the auditee pays the auditor. It's an historical thing, because the auditor was doing the interest of the shareholder at that time. Interesting that now we no longer talk about shareholders, who were normally white and men, and we talk about investors these days, which is a more acceptable term. Of course, we lose in translation. Once this thing, the system changes, this income statement starts to travel across the world, it loses that idea. With the market ideology, with the financialization of financial markets, with the belief in transparency, now we tend to see these as the only way of looking at firms, and the only perspective from which we can look at firms, the only practice that we can perform when we account, and the only institutional arrangement where a certain kind of corporate governance and a certain kind of belief in market drives the way in which we disclose things. So in a certain way, this is not an income statement. This is a political statement that says this is what is important in our society. The most important thing is the shareholder. And of course, huge belief in transparency. I mean, we heard that from Jody in a sense in the previous presentation. This is Lou Bolin, who plays with the idea of transparency and SDG and this new focus on measuring and trying to provide not only a true and fair view on financial reports, but also a true and fair view on social and environmental reports. And for those who do not know Lou Bolin, he basically is the invisible man. He paints himself as the background, and he becomes transparent. But of course, we know from Marilyn Strathern that transparency presupposes what one wants to make transparent. If I ask you what this is a bottle of water, and if I want to account for a bottle of waters, I will only see bottle of waters. If I turn this in this way and I smash it on your head, you will not see that this can actually become a weapon. So in a sense, believing in transparency could be quite deceptive. I'm Italian. You will understand from my surname, from my accent, from everything, from the Italian cars at the back of my chair. Italians don't believe in transparency. We believe in magic, and this is actually what the Duke of Windsor in The Crown said when he was looking at the first broadcasted coronation ceremony with Queen Elizabeth was anointed, and she was anointed behind a veil, and a guy said there, "Oh, this should become transparent too in the modern age," and he responded, "Who wants transparency when you can have magic?" And I think accounting can do magic, but it can do magic if you have different kind of practices, if you have different kind of focus and if you have a different kind of institutional arrangements. And so another income statement that we could have is an income statement based on value added, where you look at how value added is produced. You've got revenues, you've got the cost of producing these revenues, you have value added from other activities, and then you distribute it to amongst equal stakeholders. So this is a multifocal income statement rather than a monofocal income statement. You distribute it to employees through salaries, you distribute it to providers of interest-bearing capital through interest, the state through tax, the firm, which is the institution that allows the mediation of these different interests, and of course, shareholders. I mean, if you look at Italy, if you look at Germany, in the past, but also now, this is an income statement that is used, that was used. The Italian economic miracle is not made with the idea of the market behind, is made with this idea of a balanced society where one interest is not more important than the others, and you have to balance them. Now, we could add a further interest here. We could add a further line here. We could add nature, and this becomes a value-added statement for nature. And we consider then the nature which becomes a stakeholder with no voice. And given that it does not have voice, you need meetings amongst the humans to understand how you can give back to nature once you have destroyed the capital, the natural capital, in the production of value, which is then distributed to humans. If you think that this is crazy, in the north of Italy, for instance, even now, this is a way that is used for reporting, and in order to define this provision, there is a meeting between representative of the firm, the local community, the representative of the province, of the mayor of the city sits on that committee, and they decide how to reconstitute the capital that utility consumes. In Germany, there are similar examples, but the auditors, because in Germany now they are no longer believers in a good balance between capital and other aspects. They believe in markets, as in the United States they do. And so the auditor says, no, you cannot have this provision. While in Italy, we're still outside that influence, and that provision can happen. So we can recognize the destruction of natural capital and the need to give back to nature. What is interesting here? Is that this statement, and I'll finish in two seconds. This statement is not about transparency. It's about mediation. It's about interrogation. It's about what are we doing here? Here, the firm does not have a purpose. It's not maximizing shareholders' value. It's a discussion that emerges from the conversation amongst different stakeholders who meet at the General Assembly at the end of the year and fight amongst different stakeholders who have strong voices through trade unions, for instance, through associations of NGOs who speak for nature, through the state, which has got still a role, and of course shareholders will be there too. So this is a different focus, is a different kind of practice, is a different kind of institutional arrangement and governance. So just close here. Accounting can save the world, but it can only if we change these three things. And if it doesn't, it cannot do it on its own, but at least it can create the conditions for its salvation. So nice to be in the middle, because the middle gives hope. And I'll stop here.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll now turn to Ken for a practical perspective here. Ken.
All right, can you see the screen okay? Terrific. Well, thank you for including me in the conversation. My perspective is that of a practitioner, one who has too much to say in too little time. So I've scripted my remarks for the sake of concision. For this discussion, I focus my thoughts on voluntary reporting of carbon emissions as a proxy for the impact of non-financial disclosure on planetary impact. I recognize that carbon is only one of many important non-financial measures, but as it is one that is existential, I think it's a fair place to focus. In keeping with my training, I'll get to the answer first. I challenge the validity of the cliche, what gets measured gets managed, and believe that voluntary non-financial reporting has been ineffective and oversold. I also suspect that mandatory non-financial reporting is mostly a bootless. I begin, if we can advance, yes, I begin with a crude, albeit instructive representation of progress. According to KPMG, as of 2016, there were 383 sustainable reporting instruments. 5 years later, non-financial reporting instruments grew by more than 60% to 614. According to CDP, 90% of public companies now deliver some form of CSR report. We're now awash with standard setters and non-financial reporting requirements. At the same time, since the launch of the GRI 25 years ago, carbon emissions have increased by more than 50%. Alone, this of course proves nothing. After all, it might be that reporting has led to emissions reductions that have been overwhelmed by underlying corporate growth. While growth has certainly impacted emissions, a deeper dive reveals that voluntary reporting hasn't helped. Consider that less than 1 in 5 public companies that report to CDP even measures and reports on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions profiles today. This is 25 years after the onset of GRI. This is a big deal since scope 3 emissions most often represent the bulk of a company's corporate carbon emissions. Also recall that there are far more private than public companies. And based on my experience working in private equity, I can assure you that nowhere close to 1 in 5 private companies have any sense of their greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, less than 1% of companies report their emissions versus planetary boundaries. As but one illustration, consider the case of Timberland, a purpose-driven company where I had the opportunity to serve as chief operating officer. Here's a chart from a past CSR report. Note that carbon emissions decreased by double-digit compound annual growth rate over 5 years. Also note, however, that Timberland only measured its scope 1 and 2 emissions, which represented but 4% of total emissions. Now, almost a decade later, Timberland still does not report on its scope 3 emissions, nor for that matter does CSR warrior Patagonia. Why not? Well, it's hard. Global distributed multi-tier supply chains are difficult to track, especially as product cycles accelerate. To measure the footwear side of Timberland's scope 3 emissions, at least 30,000 data points had to be collected, often from suppliers without data and with shared facilities serving multiple brands. And that was just over a 6-month period. At the same time, notwithstanding all the headlines to the contrary, the ascendancy of ESG investing and the academic studies touting the mentions of ESG or CSR on shareholder calls, in my experience, shareholders continue to prioritize traditional measures far ahead of non-financial measures. In Timberland's case, order book growth, gross margins, and new product introduction sell-through rates trumped carbon emissions and code of conduct compliance. Even if stakeholders are inclined to prioritize non-financial data, the data is messy and not often comparable. Consider the chart at the below left, lifted from a Bloomberg Terminal ESG page last week. Were one to look at greenhouse gas emissions across one industry's public companies, they make no sense. For example, Adidas, which is 8 times the size of Columbia, is said to only have 6% of Columbia's greenhouse gas emissions. As this demonstrates, data is not comparable across companies. This is a function of selective disclosure, incomplete data, old information, a lack of agreed upon standards, and a lack of audit. Different business models also confound comparison. So what would happen were non-financial reporting to become standardized and mandatory? Evidence from other mandatory disclosure regimes isn't that compelling. The impact of point-of-purchase calorie disclosures on consumption is decidedly mixed, and according to one recent study, quote, calorie labeling does not appear to have a clinically significant effect on consumers' purchasing behavior. Mandatory disclosure emanating from the Dodd-Frank bill has done nothing to reduce the gap between executive pay and average worker pay. Finally, mandatory reporting for electric power plants in the US has led to a reduction of greenhouse gases for covered companies by 7%. However, the study also revealed that firms reallocated emissions between plants to minimize reported emissions. According to a recent literature review by Karen Mass and Peter Sampers entitled "The Expected Impacts of Regulating Non-Financial Reporting," there is, quote, there is no conclusive evidence for the relation between business performance and non-financial reporting. If there were such an obvious linkage, as some studies have concluded, don't you think that executives would be smart enough to step up their reporting efforts? One sidebar. As we've heard, academic studies fall on both sides of the question. And concerningly to me, the same academics tend to reach the same conclusions, either pro or anti connection in different studies over time. Nonetheless, what will make non-financial mandatory disclosure more effective, especially when it comes to complex and more removed from benefit, say calorie disclosure? First, a caution or a prescription for what not to do, especially for the accounting community. There is momentum building to adopt a new form of accounting, to price externalities. Proponents of impact accounting assert that dollarization of positive and negative externalities will reveal hotspots of planetary impact, thereby enabling investors to pressure companies to clean up their act. In a recent article in SSIR, Andy King and I lay out the arguments as to why impact accounting is impossible and a perilous idea, and we're happy to share a more detailed discussion at another time. Instead, to bend down the arc of carbon emissions, I believe we need to abandon faith in the failed corporate voluntary action regime and focus energies on stronger democracy and a purposeful and strong policy response. Thanks for your time.
All right, thank you, Ken. So we've heard from 4 folks, taking in a lot of information. I think the way to proceed now is I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to, well, their choice to respond to what they've heard from everybody now and give a revised response, or to select a question from the audience that they've been engaging with as well. But in the meantime, if you're in the audience and still have a question, because some of these have been engaged with along the way, please raise your hand and we'll get to you after each of the panelists have had a chance to have a go around here as well. So let me start with Jody, and now that you've heard everybody else, is there a question you'd like to answer or anything else that you'd like to respond to from across the panel?
I mean, I think a couple of points that have been raised about the actual impact on the sustainability related outcomes. So not just the capital market effects. I think that, that's a really valid point, and Ken talked about that a little bit. I mean, what I've seen when there are mandatory reporting regimes, for sure that there's no consensus. There's not yet in the research. There hasn't been as many mandated reporting regimes for sustainability related information for us to kind of reach those, I guess, conclusions. But some research and some work that I'm doing suggests that this can help to improve the outcomes, either relating to sustainability, mining safety, health and safety in restaurants. So, there's a couple of mechanisms here, like firms kind of that are reporting this information before and then see the mandates come in, try to kind of compete with each other. They see this as a way of signaling, all right, before with disclosure, we were trying to signal our commitment to this effort or to this outcome. But now that's not enough. Disclosure is not enough. So now we kind of need to raise the bar and maybe improve more actually our outcomes. And then there's just heightened stakeholder attention being paid when the information is, for example, put in the financial reports. So in the UK and a couple of other jurisdictions, for the first time ever, emissions now need to be reported in directors' reports, right, in the annual financial reports. That seems to change those dynamics as well. It just brings that attention more to the information, puts it in context relative to financial information, can overcome some of those issues with voluntary disclosure because there's a standard format to follow. You need to follow the methodology. Everyone has to be consistent. So it's like the steps that are taken, right? Transparency, establishing standardized reporting, and then looking at whether that can have real impact on, let's say, the real effects, right? The real outcomes from it. I want to add that.
So I think you have some confidence that if it were done right, it could make a difference more so. I don't know if Charles necessarily agrees then that there's even a right way to do it, so that it does matter. But Charles?
Yeah, I mean, the subsequent talks where I saw some mention about voluntary, mandatory, and regulation. And I think there was even a question on the chat. So my take is that it has been for a long time voluntary. And my view is, even though we see a lot of regulations in place and the whole standardization fiasco is happening, then this is still remain voluntary as much as how seriously will these standards be enforced? Just like, for example, in the US, the SEC enforced financial accounting standards. If we can be sure that there will be heavy consequences of greenwashing and reporting biased statements on, the statement I showed you about the blah, 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 we care about, those statements need to go. We don't care about that. We don't care what they say about what I call soft disclosure and just blah, blah, blah. We care, we love the environment. This is all BS, right? We want hard data, audited them, enforced. And when they're wrong, I mean, they get penalties, just like when you misstate financial information. So right now it's not taken seriously. It's just getting to the stage where, yes, we're going to create a standard. We're going to make it comparable, all that. But until we have a serious take on that, that will be, I think, a long ways. And as I mentioned in my talk, like reporting and action are not the same thing as of now. And just the last point, Ken pointed out the last point about the accounting for impact and new forms. I tend to slightly agree, but not completely. I think there needs to be a change on the way we do accounting, no matter what. I don't know if the right way is to go monetize and quantify externalities. And as you said, I agree that this alone definitely is not enough. But on the other hand, if you want to make it to the financial statements, you kind of have to monetize it one way or the other. So this triple bottom line, what Puma has done as a pioneer to do the triple bottom line, and some companies are doing it kind of for fun, or kind of, it doesn't really count, but they do it anyway voluntarily. Maybe that should be explored. I mean, right now in accounting statements, you don't really capture the damage to the environment, and the employees, the social and environment are not there. It's still about a very single bottom line focus geared to shareholders and stock prices, and just a 1 cent difference with the EPS and the target is going to, the stock is going to go just baloney up and down. So that needs to change in the system, but I agree that we cannot limit ourselves to say, oh yeah, let's just go for impact accounting and monetize everything or something like that. It has to be a combination of different things. So thank you.
Paulo, any magic you want to share with us?
Yeah, I think I do need a magic wand, because I don't think the problem of whether it's voluntary or compulsory is the real solution. I mean, we've been with compulsory regulation in financial reporting for years now, and scandals happen at a higher rate, I would say, than ever before. The problem is the approach. It's interesting how even critical accountants like Charles call for more measurement. It's a different, you don't need measurement. You need judgment. You need checks and scrutiny and balances to understand whether the data that is disclosed is real or not, whether it is greenwashing or not. And you need to do that in relation to money, not in relation to figures that nothing have to do with your financial disclosure. I'll give you an example and then I'll stop, which is GRI initiative, and how the GRI initiative mandated, in a sense, disclosure of in relation to the quality of food served in restaurants. You may know that McDonald's was one of the sponsors of the GRI initiative. What was the measure that was developed by the GRI initiative? The average calories intake of a menu. So that McDonald's introduces salad, reduces the average calories intake of the menu. And what is the magic? That is really magic. What is the magic of that? They shift the responsibility to the consumer, because it says, now it's your responsibility. I'm giving you a fat burger, and if you eat that for 5 years, you will die at the end of the 5th year. But I'm giving you salad too. And so, what do you want? It's your choice. I've done what the GRI wanted me to do, because you are sponsoring the GRI and you are defining the measure in a way that is convenient to you, not to the public. So measuring is not the issue. Judgment is the issue. debate is the issue, scrutiny is the issue. Ken closed with an interesting thing, reinforcing democracy. To reinforce democracy, you need to rebalance the powers of the different stakeholders. If you don't do that, measures will not solve the problem at all. It will create more opacity, not more transparency.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a vital issue of trying to figure out, who actually uses this information and how well can they process the information? I mean, even if it's all out there and perfect and every company is perfectly transparent, that doesn't mean that all of us can actually make sense of all of that information and act accordingly. But Ken, any additional perspective?
Two thoughts. One, in response to this conversation about impact accounting and externalities, Charles mentioned Puma, who pioneered the EP&L many years ago. That was then lifted from Puma and morphed into EP&L at Kering Group, which has probably the most defined EP&L that I've seen. I interviewed both companies not long ago to see how they were being used, to see if they're actually influencing management decisions, and in neither case are they. They're a separate effort that's mandated and run through the corporate team, not to influence decisions made at a local kind of divisional level, which I thought was interesting. The second point is, if you want companies to change behavior, I don't think it's about reporting. I think it's about regulating. I think it's about changing system structure or system rules related. I'm working now with a group on an act in the state of New York called the New York State Fashion Act, which focuses on any company that sells into the state of New York with revenues of $100 million and mandates a whole series of non-financial reporting. But more importantly, from my perspective, also mandates that if they want to continue to sell in the state, they have to sign up for science-based targets and reduce their carbon emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, by 4% a year absolute in order to continue to sell in the state without penalty. If that gets passed, that will do a lot more for carbon reduction, I think, than all the focus we continue to have on reporting voluntary or mandatory.
Well, I got you there, Ken. I'm going to throw this one at you because I fully agree. Regulation is necessary in these situations, and decentralizing oversight of firms to all these stakeholders who are supposed to make sense of these convoluted reports and act accordingly obviously isn't getting the job done. So, but we hear a lot of arguments about tax reform, for example, in the U.S. and raising the rates on the top earners of 1% and so forth. But the argument, the Trumpian argument is, well, those are the people who exactly are going to find ways to get around it. You'll never get them to do it. So can't we apply that same logic to companies? If we put stricter regulations on what they report, they're just going to find better ways to bullshit.
I think there's unintended consequences to these things. So I think your question's a fair one. I'm not sure in this case how one would skirt a requirement on reporting of emissions. It has to be audited by a third party. There's enforcement through the AG's office. And the reason we focused on New York State as opposed to federal legislation is because a state like New York, California, that's big enough can in fact become a de facto national standard. And it's so hard to get anything done at a federal level. So I'm sure you're right about, there'll be second order consequences that we haven't anticipated, but I'd still rather focus there than on, tightening reporting requirements.
Fair enough. Okay. No one has their hand up, so I'm just going to go to some questions that I know were there earlier, and then we'll see if others arise in the meantime. But one question that came up before was about the internal effects. So we've been talking about, does this matter for investor behavior? Does it matter for corporate behavior? But does it matter for, is this sort of mandatory reporting then going to be kind of self-reflective in ways that cause the companies to change their internal behavior as a result of having to do that? Anybody want to take that on?
I can.
Charles, you go first. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there is a body of research that looked at inside firms have access to interviews. So this is where also the different methodology from the different type of accounting research I mentioned earlier matter. That, you may not have 1,000 firms to examine, but let's say you have a case company and you go in. So there's a body. I haven't personally done that specifically. I have interviewed people, but not that. There are two things. That there are the level of engagement from the employees, of how much they're involved in the production of the report to be asked the data. So first of all, you have employees who are asked to provide data to the report, but you also have employees who are providing feedback to and suggestions. And some of the findings are, they again on the reports. Yeah, we engage our stakeholders, including our employees, so internal. But when you really interview them, they say, well, they haven't really cared about what we said, and it's just again another kind of stakeholder engagement washing kind of exercise. So and it has an effect. There are more anecdotal evidence that employees who feel that the company they work for is not meeting their values or is not in the same belief system are not happy and tend to leave because they have a belief on that. So CSR reports greenwashing is part of that. If they find out that they've been kind of busted or they know that what they report is not true from the inside perspective, I think it will have an effect. So that's my view. Another aspect is who prepares those reports. So the question often comes like, okay, is it the company itself? It is true that now we have a CSR departments or whatever they call sustainability departments, but they still have a lot of companies who are subcontracting to these PR communication marketing agencies, which is why the reports look so beautiful. They're not done by accountants. They are very creative in that way, and so in that aspect, and there is no engagement. I mean, just like, okay, we provide the information and you just put that in the next report and that's it. So in that aspect, I think employees may not even be engaged in that process. So.
Paula, did you still have more that you wanted to follow up with on that?
Yeah, I think it's better to get a question. There is an Andrea there who wants to ask. So, but
okay, Andrea.
Hi. Just to offer a little bit of an insight, and I mean, I joined it a little bit late, so I missed some of the initial discussion, but for a good reason. In fact, I just want to offer a little bit of insight as to where I was attending right before this seminar. I come from the accounting department, and today we had our accounting seminar. Every Friday, we bring different speakers from different universities. Today, we had actually some former students, and the topic was pretty much as to whether voluntary disclosures make a difference. And there was the SASB reporting requirements, and the presenter basically was presenting a paper as to finding evidence that with the SASB standards, there's an increased talk on sustainability issues on earnings calls. Now, they use identification strategies and everything to show that that was driven by the introduction of the standards and not from any other factors. Whether that's any evidence that this is real change in ESG issues, that's a whole different story. But I just want to say that, yeah, perhaps there's some evidence that they matter in that there is more talk about ESG issues on different levels. And the SASB standards, as they are standards that are mostly focused for, I think, investors, at least there's that happening there. It is a start of a conversation, and it is something that provides people who care to see these changes happen more accessible. So in my opinion, I do think that it matters. Do they alone make a difference? Definitely not, but they are there to provide a tool and a starting point and a conversation point, I think, to keep moving in the direction that we want. So that's just a little bit of insight, that's all.
Okay, any responses to that?
I can just say two things, one from experience and one that's current events. I sat next to the CFO and CEO of Timberland, as reported on 28 straight quarterly calls. A third of the CEO's remarks were devoted to what he called Timberland's justice agenda. Justice had three components: citizen service, global human rights, and environmental stewardship. Across those 7 years, we never got one question from an analyst about any of the three. I'll also tell you that Allbirds just went public. I don't know if you know the company. It's a US-based San Francisco company, footwear company, now footwear and apparel. They're a fantastic company. They genuinely care about environmental stewardship. Their product development strategies all aimed at environmental stewardship. They're a B Corp, they're a net benefit corp. They just had their first call. Again, they discussed this in their prepared remarks and got no questions. So that's just a contemporary update of the same thing. So I worry about studies that just point to, the natural language processing and use of words around sustainability. I don't think behavior is very different.
So how should we do these studies, Ken?
What's that?
So how should we do these studies?
Well, I think we have enough evidence. I think that, look, we're over a 25-year period that we've tried corporate voluntary reporting, and it's not working. Okay, I mean, just look at any metric. If you care about welfare, planetary welfare, it hasn't worked. Okay, now you can say, well, it would have been worse had we not been reporting, but I don't think there's good evidence for that either. I think there's evidence on both sides, and so I think this doesn't need to be studied anymore.
Okay, we have a huge problem though. We have an existential crisis problem. So,
and we know what, and I think we know what to do.
Preempting that they are using these firms to preempt it. So we have to be well aware of it. But
yeah, but
we're in a room full of 120 people that care about this. So what should we do? Right? We need to.
There's lots of other things.
But we have to provide solutions.
Yeah, but there's lots of other ways to provide solutions besides presenting an academic study.
In all fairness, we're focused on academic studies here mostly, but hoping that they have practical impact. But yeah, definitely.
But look at the academic studies we have. If you even want to look at the question, let's say, do high ESG firms deliver better profits, right? Which is a much studied thing and with results on both sides today from the academic community, I'd say, right? How is that helping? I mean, you have the same data being used by different academics to come to different answers.
Yeah,
I don't understand how that's helping.
Also, not all the academics study data. Charles mentioned case studies, for instance, and there are examples of solutions that work. And so it's also, depending on what kind of study you do, you get different perspectives and different views, and they need to be, put in dissonance somehow.
Case studies, worry me as well, though, I'm sorry to say, because look at the whole creating shared value case study based approach that was promoted by folks, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. They were, cherry pick case studies that don't actually manifest broadly. And so I just worry about that as a tool.
Aren't the examples you've been providing to us, anecdotal
I was going to say
items like
at least we do it a bit more rigorously than a normal person.
Well, I can only present my experience, Jody.
Yeah, understood.
I'll add to Ken's point, though, that so I did put a link of there was a comment letter for that IFRS thing, and then they asked for references. So it's 50 years of research of social accounting that is not recognized by a certain member of the accounting academic community, which is a problem in itself. But you can see that there are a lot of research. Now, to Ken's point, though, it's a different debate. And this is something I'm involved in on the side, that the impact of academic research is not where it should be. And we had a debate kind of similar in the QUASI, I think, Mike, 2 seminars ago, about whether academic research should address grand challenges and the practice. So I think Ken has a point in a way that we can do all the research you want and publish in this so-called top journal that has whatever impact factor and whatever ranking it is and whatever going to give you a bunch of money in promotion. But in practice, we are still here. And if we are satisfied by just having this publication and there's nothing beyond that, then his point is well taken, right? I mean, the rigor and evidence, yes, there needs to be academic studies, but then what do you do? What do you do beyond that? Where do you go? It gets buried in a paywall journal that nobody reads. Only academics read. So that would be my point.
Well, that was even another quasi about that. But okay. Yeah, fair enough. So you guys are addressing exactly what this is intended to do, which is, see whether or not there are some practical implications and additional research that would help in that domain. But let's move over to Andy. Andy King, what's your question?
Well, it's more of a comment.
Oh, I figured. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mike. Well, first of all, what's interesting to me about the conversation is a great deal of this seems to be begging the question. the assumption is that disclosure will work. And so therefore we need to go investigate disclosure and how it will work. But it's all based on the assumption that will work. So it's sort of, which is something I don't really understand. And there is, as Ken pointed out, considerable historical work on the success of disclosure and even its manipulation by the right as a means of preventing more systematic change, which we seem to ignore. So I think I just want to raise again the issue that we don't know that disclosure works. In fact, we don't really know anything very much about it. And if anything, we think it may not work, or at least not very effectively. And then the second thing, which I think is another logical fallacy, is the notion that pointing out that something doesn't work is insufficient. So that goes like this. It's like, you're saying that this doesn't work, or there's no evidence that it works. That's not good enough. Tell us what the solution is. But that doesn't make any sense to me, because that could be used to shut down all kinds of corrective research. You can imagine that the proponents of hydroxychloroquine could have said, well, don't tell me that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. Tell me what the solution to COVID is. But we wouldn't in that circumstance allow that kind of argument. So I think making Ken's argument that there's really no evidence here, my experience doesn't go in this direction. I can't personally, Andy, can't think of one that really shows a good link to impact. And yet we're all sitting very excitedly about this and proposing this as some kind of major intervention to the world economy that's going to bring about something better. I think we got to be a little more humble than that. So, and particularly since there's another part of disclosure here, which I think that's, kind of the elephant in the room, is there's a lot of money to be made in this space right now. And there's a lot of money that you can generate if you can find a positive finding and go out and start your consulting company, or go sit on a board, or consult to this investing group. We maybe need to clean up our own act about being more honest with our disclosing of our own financial connections and reporting our data to all these studies, so we can better understand when things are cherry picked and whether the findings are robust.
All right, thanks, Andy. Paulo?
Yeah, I want to comment on the first comment of Andy. This idea of disclosure, that is a really Anglo-American tradition, as if you got truth and this message can be communicated to a passive audience. I don't think that accounting emerged and diffused until 1980, I would say, from at least the 15th century. In that way. So you are talking about a model of accounting that pushes information out to the market, while instead in continental Europe, we have a model of accounting that pull the stakeholders into the creation of the numbers, because as every accountant knows, there is not such thing as truth, but you cannot stretch the truth that much. And so in producing the numbers, you need to have the conversation with the different stakeholders. The example I gave of that provision for nature, that provision is defined by putting together the firm, a utility, the community with some stakeholders, the regulator, the province, and the mayor of the city. And so it's not that they disclose the information, they co-construct the information. In that sense, accounting and reporting becomes governance. Otherwise, this is exactly why we got these problems, because if you think that you can disclose the real information, good luck.
Well, if I can just respond, that is, of course, an ad hominem beginning to your argument to basically label me as Anglo-American. I think that's, that's not the best beginning to an argument. The second thing is, a good friend of mine sits on the board of the Coca-Cola European Partners. And I've talked to him about the reporting requirements and whether they're bringing in people or not. And it's not, my understanding from him is what you're describing may occur, but it's certainly not a norm across European business practice.
Okay.
If I can just say, it is no longer, it was until 1980. That value-added statement was possible until the fourth European directive and until the first IIS. It was then cancelled the moment in which the idea of market came in and IFRS became the dominant hegemony. Just studying a bit of history would tell you that.
Okay, so we've got a lot of different international country differences as well to consider here. Let's go to Guillaume Payne. What's your question, please?
Hi, it's not really a question, it's a comment, but I think it resonates well with the discussion so far, if you allow it. So we've talked a lot about the transparency of reporting, and of course we've mentioned greenwashing, and so I think an important question, if we look at the reports as a representation of what the companies have done in terms of sustainability actions, I'm talking about environmental sustainability, not really social responsibility, then one question is, are these actions effective? Do they have an impact? Do they actually reduce the environmental damage of these companies? And so I think it would be interesting in studies, and I'm actually working on that topic, to try and relate disclosed corporate action and disclosed corporate environmental actions to corporate environmental performance from a third-party independent source of environmental performance data. And what I'm doing now is I'm fact-checking the reports on environmental actions, because companies have been accused of greenwashing, and reports are not credible. But what we find in the subsample of reports that we're looking at right now is so far we have accuracy of environmental actions somewhere between 60 and 80%. So what the companies say they do, they seem to actually do, or at least an independent third party has actually noticed them doing it. So my point is, yes, companies embellish what they do, and I think greenwashing is also withholding the bad that they do. And there are studies that show that sustainability reports do not mention, environmental catastrophes, for example, or they downplay them or not mention them at all. But on what they do, even though we know that it's embellished, an important question is whether these actions are effective. And so yeah, I think that's one area of study that should be further explored in the future. Right. And that would inform our discussion today.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that companies in all matters present themselves in the best possible way that they feasibly can, given all the consultants that work with them, subject to regulatory oversight. But and I think the whole discussion we've had is whether or not it works, and whether or not it actually changes behavior. It doesn't seem to, but it can be of use to investors. Naza, what was your question, please?
So, hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Just want to make sure that it works. So I have a question for all the panelists, and just something that is a radical thinking that I was, I read from a publication in 2018 in the Journal of Cleaner Production, and there were authors who were saying that currently we operate under the natural resource-based view and the triple bottom line. And companies try to seek a balanced approach among the financial, environmental, and the social dimensions, but actually they prioritize the financial over the social and the environmental, and they focus on reducing the negative externalities. But we need to move towards a double bottom line of enhanced social and ecological well-being while maintaining financial viability. So I was just, this operates under the radical resource-based view. And I was thinking of how could, companies move towards a double bottom line, and is this possible? And there was also a recent publication in Journal of Management Studies, and it was talking about how we operate under a non-cooperative social structure, where basically, powerful agents like UN and NGOs, they're not really, because of operating under a capitalist market mechanism like the bottom of the pyramid or microfinance, all those mechanisms, they are actually imprisoning those that are the refugees and those that we have to target as, to empower them and etc., those marginalized. So it's just, some interesting thoughts that I had and questions that I wanted to ask the panelists in terms of their views. Is this possible? Can we move towards a double bottom line approach? And how can we, mitigate the problem of a non-cooperative social structure, which goes back to a capitalist market mechanism? So, yeah.
Any responses to that?
I would just note that the architect, I think, of the triple bottom line was John Elkington, and he wrote a piece probably 2 years ago in HBR suggesting that it be withdrawn.
Yeah. Any other responses?
If I can say very, very quickly, I don't think in triple or double. I believe in one. If you do not ask people to put their hands in their pocket in order to solve the environmental or social issues, all the rest will become, greenwashing or PR and com. This is why that income statement with the allowance for or provision for nature, how much are you willing to give up of the money that you're receiving in order to save the environment? How much are you willing to give up to increase the minimum wage of your workers? How much are you willing to give up to increase taxes? Or how much is the state willing to reduce the taxes in order to pursue social and environmental issues through the firm? One bottom line, just calculated differently.
It's an interesting point too. I mean, as we've run out of time here to end on, because the win-win rhetoric is widespread, and if it's win-win, it's very easy to comply. If it's not win-win, then we run into some real problems. What I want to do, since we've hit the bewitching hour here, is to say that we've got all this talent assembled. I'm glad to keep the space open for a bit longer, see if there are other folks with other questions, if our panelists can stick around. I think you guys still want to talk to each other. I hope so, if you still have a few more minutes, but I'm going to just wrap this up and then we'll end the recording, and then we can speak much more freely after that as well. But so let me just wrap this up, please. A sincere thanks to the panelists for a great debate, and many thanks to all of you for participating. The materials from today's session will soon be posted on the RICSI website, which is at ricsi.business.rutgers.edu. Please join us for the next quasi seminar on April 1st, no fooling, when we'll debate the question, does social media facilitate corporate misconduct? That session will feature Brian Husted, Michael Etter, Rhonda Rieger, and Craig Carroll. I do hope to see you there. Deb, can you kill the recording?